This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
I'm Bill Chu from Vancouver, BC, arguably the beachhead for PLC's unrestricted warfare in Canada. That name is coined after a 1999 book of the same name by two PLA corporals describing a new warfare which do not use conventional weapons like guns and bombs, but stealth weapons ranging from disinformation via media, influence buying by bribes, sex, trade, fame, threats, etc., as well as cyber hacking, data harvesting, and intellectual espionage. So no soldiers are required to be transported in, as the idea is to convert locals into its foot soldiers. It's a perfect plan, as by blurring the boundaries or even presence of a war, PLC has also gained the image of a so-called peace-seeking country. However, through WeChat and other things, PLC has been silently sending official news and directives to tens and thousands of Chinese students and immigrants here. Coupled with pro-PLC local Chinese language media and social platforms, PLC had gained more influence over a large part of the local Chinese community than arguably Canada itself. It can and has mobilized large groups of Chinese here when needed. Undoubtedly, Canadians have sensed something amiss after hearing all kinds of PLC undue influences in Canada, but are unsure whether the government is aware of the seriousness or had a plan to deal with them. Sadly, such unpreparedness and attempts to even trivialize the danger were exposed in the PM's latest reaction to the news of PLC's election interference. It is easy to underestimate China, which for decades kept its head low. But fast forward to its entry in WTO, and the world has since been bedazzled by its rocket-like rise that most forgot. PLC is a one-party authoritarian state which outlaws ideological pluralism. So communism should never be mixed up, even by the self-proclaimed progressives, as a legitimate choice, since accepting it ironically means no more choice. Accordingly, China's leaders do not need a popular vote to get in or stay in power. So for 7 decades, they develop a habit of ignoring the people's outcries or rights, but rely on propagandas, lies, and brutal suppression to control dissent. And it's easy to do when 3 branches of the government are only supposed to serve the party's interest. And China, for decades, was separated from the world. But with PLC entering the world stage, its leaders have to struggle to maintain the validity of its problematic ideology and related wild claims in front of not just its people, but the world's. So within the secret warfare it's waging globally, it spent billions on buying or expanding media, on propagandas, including getting full-page ads and inserts in prominent Western papers. And by dismissing any criticism of CPP as baseless lies, or lately as quote-unquote anti-Chinese racism. To prepare for the latter, they have for decades intentionally mixed up the use of the terms CCP, the party, China, the state, and Chinese, the people. The purpose are simply to silence criticisms against the CCP by equating that or as criticisms of all Chinese, and also to rouse up a distorted sense of nationalism among all Chinese, including the diaspora. The fact is, PLC's United Front's work department has long been at work within the Chinese diaspora communities. The 70s in particular was an opportune time for CCP in Canada, as Canada just removed the last of all the discriminatory legislations against the Chinese, and with Chinese Canadians entering a more equitable and stable life, most old local Chinese clan organizations discovered their historical mandate was suddenly gone. In Vancouver, a notable example is the CBA of Vancouver, a sad story of a century-old Chinatown association whose name recognition was quickly identified as exploitable by the CCP, and which in recent years was seen in full-page ads in Chinese language papers, dutifully leading hundreds of Chinese organizations echoing their support for China's draconian policies.
Okay, Mr. Chu, we're beyond the 5 minutes at this point. I know that members of the committee are going to have lots of questions. If we can just stop it there, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Mr. Chu, with about a minute remaining for my time, can you share some examples of intimidation or influence attempts that targeted your group? And you're on mute, sir.
Address it as to the community rather than just our group, because over time we have been in the community watching or monitoring how things are developing within the Chinese community in Vancouver area, and we have seen the pro-CCP elements have been able to mobilize a large group of people to do counter-protests. Even when, a group of people are concerned about the situation in Hong Kong, say, we noticed that there have been, and you probably have noticed, crashes, physical crashes, public ones on the street. And that's something, to us is not acceptable, and is one of the prime examples. And among our group, by the way, there's also one individual that have received phone threats, direct threats in the evening at her home number, and threatening her. So that those things are happening.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chu. Mr. Chu, in your opening statement, you talked about the Prime Minister's reaction, that it seemed to trivialize, I think was the word that you used, the seriousness of the issue. Understand that you have written the Prime Minister outlining some of your concerns about the communist dictatorship in Beijing's interference in Canada. I'm wondering, I'd like to give you about a minute if you could maybe expand on what you wrote to the Prime Minister. Mr. Chu.
I think it's not so much what I wrote, but our group had actually wrote an open letter. But essentially it's trying to underline the fact that so much had been happening, right in our community, and we are not seeing the appropriate responses. And we urge the government to focus on simple things like the media, the Chinese language media, what they are doing within the community. Now I can't recall exactly what the words we said, but essentially, it's under the guise or the cover of another language. They can get away with a different version of reality. That's what we are facing as a community. And that's been also causing fear among so many people, because once you have a government, which is a one-party government, and only had one focus, then we are the only community that's really exposed to that kind of brainwashing almost. In other words, the kind of narratives and philosophy, ideology are different from what the average Canadians are exposed to. And that's a very, oppressive feeling. We don't have diversity in terms of our news commentating, or getting narrower and narrower. So, it's a shrinking kind of freedom that we are having in that sense.
Thank you for that. And just to clarify, that open letter that you sent to the Prime Minister and the government, did you receive a response?
Not that we can recall.
Okay. Thank you for that. You mentioned something that I found really concerning, and that's that the communist dictatorship in Beijing is exploiting the Chinese diaspora, and in particular the history, and in many cases the rich history that makes up much of of Canada, and I'd like to give you an opportunity if you can expand a little bit on that. You had mentioned an organization, in particular in Vancouver, that how does the CCP exploit both the Chinese diaspora? You'd mentioned language, newspapers and news sources, and heritage. Just in about 50 seconds that I've left, could you expand on that a little bit?
Well, first of all, the Chinese community had undergone a long history of discrimination in Canada until the 60s, 70s. That's when, only when all those legislation were removed, and so the CCP is trying to exploit that history to remind most Chinese Canadians that they need motherland to protect them, almost in their way of expressing it, and they are trying to combine it with the current situation, the tension between East and West, to suggest that this is all these are just China bullying, and use the phrase racism as an excuse to deflect any criticisms launched against the CCP. And those are the ways that they are using history to try to pull the heartstrings of so many Chinese Canadians.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chu, in a few words, do you believe that the Government of Canada understands China well?
I don't, simply by looking at how their responses to so many infiltrations and undue influence have been. And I don't think they are aware of the fact that China is using a lot of government-organized but non-governmental organizations, both locally and overseas, even totally apparently harmless names, for example, Chinese Students and Scholars Association. That kind of global organizations are literally controlling so many university student bodies, in Canada and elsewhere.